Hello, everybody. My name is AIJ2009. The Cold War is going to escalate into World War III. Now, World War III is always a terrifying concept because because of nuclear bombs. And the Cold War started because the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a brutal Cold War over nuclear bombs. Both countries had nukes. And they had the nukes that would destroy each other. There were a lot of proxy conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cambodia Civil War, the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the Ethiopia-Somalia War. But there's one pretty specific event that could have caused World War III. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a thing that happened in October 1962. And if it wasn't handled correctly, it could have sparked a World War III between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Luckily, the situation was resolved, and we're all still here, and I'm making videos for you, so we're not cooked. But anyway, the Cuban Missile Crisis will actually become World War III. The Soviets refusing to put the nuclear bombs off of Cuba, and the Americans refusing to get nuclear bombs out of Turkey. And so the United States decides to declare war on the Soviet Union, thus starting World War III. The Americans would invade Cuba in an attempt to seize the nuclear weapons by force. Fidel Castro would flee to Latin America, more specifically Venezuela, where he would hang out in Caracas. Or how is that name called? The Soviet Union would initiate the 7 days to the river Rhine plan, where they would launch an attack into German territory. And they would take Würzburg and Hamburg. Frankfurt would also fall. The Germans would annex their territory. Yeah. A combined Czechoslovak-Hungarian force would invade Austria, taking over Vienna. The Warsaw Pact would invade Greece. Now, they would try their luck in an invasion of Greece. But like usual, it would end in a failure, with the Greeks pushing them back. Kinda like Mussolini, huh? The Soviets would have to get involved. And the Warsaw Pact would push into into Greece. With the capture, Thessaloniki would be captured by the Yugoslavs. And Corfu would be captured by the Albanians. They would also capture Patrias. The Soviet Union would take Athens as the Greeks would flee to Crete. And the Soviets would establish a Socialist Union of Hellas as a puppet state. That Hellas would take Crete, and they would rule the Icarian Sea. This is the Ionian Sea. They would rule the Aegean Sea, and they would rule the Ionian, Aegean, and Icarian Seas. Bulgarian forces would push into Istanbul as Soviet forces will invade Iran, taking Tehran and taking the Caspian Sea. They would also launch an invasion into Turkey, with Turkey giving Kurdistan independence, as more people will be willing to fight for Kurdistan. This is mainly to get more people to join the NATO cause, as NATO is not looking too good. The Yugoslavs will push into Italy, and they would get far. Oh, and also Tito would join the Warsaw Pact, because I said so. Syria would invade Israel, and they would take Tel Aviv, but Israel would claim Palestine and the Golan Heights. Basically a historical version of the historical Six-Day War. And Israel is now doing good. They also taken Damascus. American forces would occupy Syria. The Soviets would invade Alaska. And would get to Anchorage. Oh, wait. North Korea would invade South Korea, pushing to Seoul. And going all the way to Busan before Japan would create a government in exile for the South Koreans. On... What's this island called? This is Hokkaido, this is Honshu. I don't know what these smaller islands were called. The Soviets would invade Hokkaido and would take Sapporo. The Soviets would also invade Finland, starting the Winter War. The Soviets would be pushed out of Finland, and Finland would join NATO. The Soviets get humiliated, just like they did in Finland. On the German front, all's not looking too good, as the Democratic Republic of Germany takes Munich and will invade into Austria. Taking it. The United Arab Republics will push into the Levant, taking Beersheba. But they would lose the Suez as a result of this. Making transportation from the Bab el-Andus Strait easier for NATO. Spain would experience some communist rebellions, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque. The Catalonians, this would force Spain to join NATO. As Basque uprisings happen. Yeah. Madrid would fall and Spain would be split into puppet states. But the Basque and Spanish People's Republic would be one. Catalonia and Andalusia would be puppets. As the People's Union of Spain, as the Spanish People's Republic pushes into Portugal. Lisbon falls and Portugal becomes a government in exile in Angola and Mozambique. Another puppet state... Sorry, my throat is cooked. Would be established in Portugal, the Portuguese Communist Republic. I really need to think of better and more creative names. Spain would invade into Andorra and France, thus resulting in the Democratic Republic of Germany to do the exact same thing the Germans did in World War II. They would push through the Ardennes forest, and they would encircle some troops. But the British will make a miraculous leaving of Dunkirk. And the French would be taken over by the communists. Yeah, this isn't looking good for NATO. The French would become a puppet state, the French Commune, which is basically Vichy France. Italy would just take Nice and Savoy, because France surrendered that quickly. Oops. I realized France would just create a government in exile from their colonies. Anyway, the Djibouti colony rebels against the French Commune and would establish Free France. Basically rebelling, this is basically similar to how the French rebelled against the Vichy regime in World War II. The American invasion of Cuba is going well, and Cuba would get surrendered. But in Castro would launch a communist revolution. So anyway, Castro would uprise in Caracas. The Venezuelan Civil War has started. And I just realized I started recording this video before the United States captured the Maduro, the dictator of Venezuela. Yeah, this is not the best time to record this video. So anyway, Venezuela would join the Warsaw Pact and would invade NATO forces in the Caribbean and Guyana. Brazil would join. Brazil, being an American ally, would join NATO and would invade into Venezuela. Yeah. Castro's regime would push back against Brazil and would take over Guyana. What? This is not looking good for NATO. Well, it's about to get a whole lot worse, as Operation Sea Lion would be launched by the British, or the Soviets, and it would invade the British Isles, landing in Cornwall and Dover. The British, getting desperate, would cede Northern Ireland to Ireland, and in response, and Ireland would join NATO in response, and would give Wales and Scotland independence, and they would join NATO. The French would declare war on Italy, pushing into Milan and Genoa. They would also land in Corsica and Sardinia, and they would establish a puppet regime, the Italian Communist Republic. And the Italian Civil War would start, and Rome would be taken. The Soviets would also land here, as Italy would basically become what Greece was in World War II. Yeah, not looking good for NATO, huh? The Alaskan invasion would get worse, as it would take Fairbanks and Yukon. What is that name? Yukon Okoyokoko. What? What? What is this place name? Like, what is this place name? Yukon Okoyokuk. Why is it named like that? That's the weirdest name I've seen. Anyway, back to World War III. Here we are. Finland would join NATO, and they would start another winter war. But the Soviets would encircle Helsinki, and the Swedes would occupy the Åland Islands as a Swedish puppet state. Anyway, the Soviets would completely take over Finland, and they would establish a Finnish Socialist Republic, and they would invade Sweden. Yeah. Not looking good for NATO, huh? Anyway, in the Ogaden region of Ethiopia, Ethiopian socialists rise up, and the American would sponsor a democratic Somalia coup and would establish the Federal Republic of Somalia. The Ethiopian Socialist Republic would take Addis Ababa, and they would win the war. And they would declare war on, and they would take Djibouti and take Somaliland. Now the Bandir al-Abwab, now The southern part of the Deir al-Abab Strait is occupied by the Soviets. So anyway, the Brits would push the Soviets out of. So anyway, the Soviets would take London, and they would establish an English Communist Republic. But the British will never surrender. As Winston Churchill said, "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight in growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Of course, Winston Churchill is long dead. Anyway, the Prime Minister of the UK at this time would say that. This would increase morale with the British, as it would liberate London and Dover, and they would push them out of Cornwall, establishing the Kingdom of Cornwall as another state. The Japanese, after would be landed in Honshu. China would take Taiwan, and it would aid North Vietnam invading South Vietnam. Eventually, Saigon will be taken, and North Vietnam would fall. This would prompt the Americans to invade Vietnam, thus creating a historical version of the Vietnam. This would basically be the Vietnam War historically. And this is not good. Namibia will gain independence from apartheid South Africa. And the Americans would invade South Africa to get apartheid out of the nation. Nelson Mandela will be in charge of this new country. How old was Nelson Mandela in 1962? South Africa is being liberated by the Africans, and they would join NATO, along with Namibia. Switzerland would be invaded by the Germans, and this would result in Switzerland to join NATO. Yeah. What is this? The Soviets would take more of Lapland, and they would establish the Sami People's Republic as another state. The Americans would continue to push into Ethiopia, and Somalia would be liberated. Free France would reclaim Djibouti and would take Eritrea, as Ethiopia would come under American occupation, just like Syria. Oh wait, I need to do Alaska. Like, okay. The Americans would begin planning a liberation of Europe. From Portugal. The Americans would land in Madrid, or Lisbon. This is not Madrid, this is Lisbon. This is a very risky landing. Not the D-Day landings. Operation Blue Eagle would be launched as a naval invasion of Portugal and Spain. The Portuguese would get their land back, as the liberation would follow, and the communist government gets overthrown. Was Tunisia NATO? By now, I'm assuming the year is 1966. A lot has happened. They would then launch the Operation Northern Blitz, which will be a liberation of Alaska. Anchorage will be taken, and Canada will get some land in Alaska. Operation Northern Blitz wouldn't end there, though, as the Americans would land in Siberia. And Japan would re-liberate their lands and would take some parts of Sakhalin. The landings in Vietnam would liberate Saigon and would push to take Hanoi, making Vietnam surrender, and they will be united under South Vietnam. Here they are. The Americans would begin planning a revolution in Sicily, along with the Italian resistance movement. Greece would also be liberated from the Hellenic Socialist Union rule. The Italian resistance movement would take back Naples, and they would encircle Rome after taking Naples. Naples would be the center of this resistance. The world is not looking so red anymore, as the war is turning around. But after this is where we will see World War III rage on. Okay, guys, this is going to be the end of this video. Please like, subscribe, and hit that bell to turn notifications. I'll see you in the next one where World War III will rage on. Ideologies J2009 out. Bye!